What's going on, guys? My name is Aaron, and this is the Game Day Hour. Welcome back to another episode. In today's episode, we're going to be continuing our fantasy football division review with the AFC South. The AFC South consists of the Houston Texans, the Tennessee Titans, the Indianapolis Colts, and the Jacksonville Jaguars. We're going to be looking through these teams' rosters to see which players I would draft in fantasy football, where I would draft them in a tier list form. Now, we did the first 4 episodes, but then the last 3 to 4 weeks we had 1 week where we were off, then we had 2 soccer videos, and of course the NBA Finals video. Now, time to continue through the month of July for fantasy football as we creep closer and closer to the NFL and college football season. So it's going to be very exciting. There's 28 players we're going to be looking at today. 8 from the Texans, 8 from the Titans, 6 from the Colts, and 6 from the Jaguars. Without further ado, let's get started. All right, we're in the tier list now, and in case you guys have forgot or you need to be put up to date or this is your first time watching a fantasy football division review, we have all the players down here, and our goal is to place them whether I think they'll be drafted in these rounds, this round, these 3 rounds, these 5 rounds, or if they're not going to be drafted at all. So we're going to start with the Houston Texans, and a lot of our picks are going to be based on the stats of last season and how I feel they're going to be doing this season. So without further ado, let's start with the Houston Texans. The first player we're going to be looking at is CJ Stroud, and he has a lot of value going for him this year with the acquisition of Stephon Diggs, Joe Mixon, and some more. And it's really, really important to know that last year he made 2 wide receivers who have never been considered number ones, both considered number one. So people say he's working with 3 wide receiver 1s. But before he got Stephon Diggs and was in his rookie year, last season he had 4,108 passing yards with 26 touchdowns and only 5 interceptions. That is 313 fantasy points. That was 11th among all quarterbacks. So I believe he is going to be on the upward rise, but not enough to get him around 1 through 2 nod. There's very few quarterbacks I would put up here because these rounds are more dominated by wide receivers and running backs. So this is where you tend to see the top quarterbacks start to go off the board relatively. But yeah, I think he's an early round 3 type pick, and I put a lot of stock into him because the last time a player got Stephon Diggs on their team, it was Josh Allen in 2020. I had that guy on my fantasy team with Stephon Diggs and won the championship. So I'm putting some high stock into CJ Stroud. I think he's going to do great this year. Next up, we have Joe Mixon, and Joe Mixon, of course, was at the Bengals last year, and last season he had 1,034 rushing yards, 376 catching yards, and a total of 12 touchdowns. For fantasy football, that's 197 fantasy points. That's 7th among all running backs. So he was extremely valuable for the Bengals, even though they didn't have Joe Burrow. He was everything they needed to be, but the difference between here with the Houston Texans versus with the Bengals is that you got that second running back, which is going to offset some things for the most part. And I think Joe Mixon, while I don't think his stats are necessarily going to go down, I do think he's going to kind of stay in that relative area. He's just bordering on being a round 1 through 2. I think he's also a high round 3 draft pick, but I guess you're just going to have to wait and see. Next up, we have Dameon Pierce. Now, Dameon Pierce is somebody who I was really disappointed with last season. Because his rookie year was so great, I thought he was going to be the centerpiece of that Texans offense because I thought Stroud was going to need some work, but clearly that wasn't the case. And overall, he didn't do much. So, last year, Pierce had 416 rushing yards and only 2 touchdowns. That's 54 fantasy points. That's 54th. For the good rookie season that he had, this is kind of embarrassing. And now that he is being downgraded to the second running back, it's really going to be tough to tell whether I draft him. I think you can still draft him. Maybe him being the second running back is important. Some players prosper off of that, like Tony Pollard. But overall, I think this is where you're going to get him, or in any other cases, he's going to fall down here. But I guess we're going to have to wait and see. Maybe, again, being the second running back on the roster could be a benefit for him. Next up, the newly acquired Stefon Diggs. Stefon Diggs last season, in his last season with the Bills, he had 1,183 receiving yards. He also had 8 touchdowns, and that accumulated 160 fantasy points, which was 12th among all wide receivers. Now, ever since that 2020 season, Diggs has always been a top round 1 through 2 type of wide receiver. And even though he's on a team where 2 wide receivers could compete with that spot, he's going to slightly fall out of rounds 1 through 2. But I'm going to say here is the spot where I'd have him. There's a lot of Texans going to go early in those round 3s, and I don't think you can really blame that situation. I just think that because Diggs has a better core with him for CJ Stroud, that his production might go down, or it might not. But still, I think he has a high prospect, and this is a great spot to have him. I mean, it's going to be impressive to see this wide receiver core in full throttle, but Diggs, I have him as an early round 3 type of pick. Next up, we have Nico Collins, who last season had 1,297 receiving yards and 8 touchdowns. That's 174 fantasy points. He was top 10 at number 8 among all wide receivers. So a very impressive year for Nico Collins. And I mean, CJ Stroud made him look amazing, and he himself is just one incredible wide receiver. But with the acquisition of Diggs, I think he's an early 6 through 9. I can't see him being drafted higher. I know for most leagues they have Nico over Stefon, but I'm just not seeing that just yet. I think that Diggs is going to get the majority of the catches. But Nico is still somebody who could go early in these rounds. He's going to have as much value as a Jalen Waddle, a Devonta Smith, or a T. Higgins, those high-end wide receiver 2s on their respective teams being drafted pretty high. So I think Nico Collins can just inch his way there. And then lastly, we have Tank Dell, or Nathaniel Dell, however you want to call him. He had 709 receiving yards, 7 touchdowns. That's 112 fantasy points. He was 37th, but he kind of got pushed back due to injury. Tank last year, he was good. He had some great standout games, but then that injury set him back. I think that because there's so many high-octane wide receivers, Tank is going to be high here. He's going to be one of the best wide receiver 3s going into the year, but because there's so many wide receiver 1s and wide receiver 2s, I have a tough time seeing him going as early as these first 9 rounds. I think he'll go early in the later rounds, but I mean, if you manage to get him higher and he does end up going off, then props to you. I just don't know how I would rank these based on, because they're all wide receiver 1s legitimately, but Stefon Diggs is a far better wide receiver in that case. Next up, we have Dalton Schultz, and Dalton Schultz is one of the best tight ends in the league. Last year, he had 635 receiving yards, 5 touchdowns, and 87 fantasy points. That was 10th among all tight ends. Dalton Schultz is going to probably go somewhere here, maybe even down there, because tight ends don't get a lot of stock. And I think that this is the best he can possibly do, which would be great for him. So yeah, Dalton Schultz being with Nico Collins here makes a lot of sense. And then lastly, that defense. Surprisingly, the Texans defense, which struggled for the past few years, had 169 fantasy points. That is 14th among all defenses in the league. So they're clearly draftable. I'd say somewhere here. And I think they're going to get better. I mean, their front looks amazing, and they have a pretty good secondary. They have a pretty balanced defense, and if their offense can be as high-powered as possible, it can give the defense a lot of momentum and a lot of courage to be the best that they can possibly be, and probably be a top 10 defense by the end of the year. Who knows? But yeah, the Texans, I have high hopes for them. Nobody going in the first 2 rounds, and nobody going undrafted. And then rounds 3 through 5, you got Stefon, Joe Mixon, and CJ Stroud. 6 through 9, you have Nico Collins, and you have Dalton Schultz. And then rounds 10 through 15, you got Tank Dell, the defense, and Dameon Pierce. So, Texans, I hope you're excited. Now it's time to move on and grab the Tennessee Titans. First up, we have Will Levis. Now, Will Levis is the quarterback that I've been questioning when I was doing the Tennessee Titans shorts on YouTube, because I don't know what to make of him. I love his confidence, but his game, does it translate? I don't know, man. Let's see. Last season, Will Levis had 1,808 passing yards, and it's because he didn't play the majority of the year, or at least first half of it. And he had 9 touchdowns and 4 interceptions. That's 115 fantasy points. That's 32nd among all quarterbacks. But we know going forward now, it's most likely going to be Will Levis, so it's really hard to determine where I would want him. But for now, I think he's going to go undrafted. And that's because I don't think he's proved himself enough. Like, you kind of catch my drift on this. I mean, I don't know if he's proved enough to be a fantasy quality quarterback. I remember they were like projecting his numbers super high because of one game, and then afterwards I didn't think he had those kind of numbers after that. So I think he's going to stay as undrafted. Next up, we have Tony Pollard, and what big shoes to fill if you're Tennessee or Tony Pollard, because you lost Derrick Henry to Baltimore, and now you have Pollard and Spears in the backfield. These are two similar style running backs, in my opinion. I mean, I don't know. They're not as strong as Derrick Henry is, but Pollard last year for the Cowboys, he had 1,005 rushing yards, 311 receiving yards, and 6 touchdowns. That's 155 fantasy points. That's 20th among all running backs. That's running back 2, running back 3 kind of stats. So, I don't know. I just don't know that you can fill the shoes of Derrick Henry the way Derrick Henry was and be able to say Tony Pollard is your starting running back. And this is coming from a Cowboys fan as well. I like Pollard, but I'm not completely sure or sold on Pollard. I do think he's still draftable. I'd say somewhere in these middle rounds, because I do think there are a lot of better running backs available, and I just don't think that he's going to be that effective for Tennessee. But I still think he's going to get you the points you need for a running back too. So this is kind of where I would have him. I just don't know if his production is going to go higher or lower because of Spears. So this is kind of my middle ground, being safe kind of pick, if that makes sense. And then the other running back we're going to be looking at is Tyjae Spears. 453 rushing yards, 385 catching yards or receiving yards, and 4 touchdowns. That's 85 fantasy points. That was 40th among all running backs. So he just kind of makes the cut for being on a running back roster. But Spears needs to develop quickly. I don't know how long you can work with Pollard as your main running back. So Spears is going to have to, do a lot better. And I think he will. I would say he's somebody who maybe I'll spend a late draft pick on, but just maybe. I'm not completely sure. So this is as high as I'll put him, the rounds 10 through 15, maybe a round 15 type of running back, even though those rounds for me are more for your last defense or your last kicker, if that makes sense. So there's nothing more to say about this running back core. It's not as impressive as it looks. So next up, we have Calvin Ridley. Calvin Ridley is one of the premier wide receivers in the league. And for the Jaguars last year, despite so many people complaining about him, he still put up some great numbers. Last year, he had 1,016 receiving yards and 8 touchdowns. That's 147 fantasy points. That was 17th among all wide receivers. That's wide receiver 2 range. So he's still somebody who is, in my opinion, highly draftable. And I'd say somewhere in here. I mean, the Titans don't really have anybody really that you draft that high, so you kind of just, they're like utility picks. They're not really going to be in your starting lineup for the most part, but they're good to have on your bench. Calvin Ridley is the closest thing to being a starter, but I think he's going to be right here because I did think his production wasn't that great with Jacksonville, despite being the 17th best wide receiver fantasy-wise. So this is a good spot to have him. Next up, we have DeAndre Hopkins. Now, I'm a big Hopkins guy. I liked him since he was with the Texans, even with the Cardinals, even though I never really watched the Cardinals game. I did watch that Bills-Cardinals game when he had the Hail Mary touchdown, which was arguably one of his greatest highlights ever, and he has a lot. Last year for Tennessee, he had 1,057 receiving yards and 7 touchdowns. That's 141 fantasy points. That was 20th among all receivers. So they do have a very impressive core. So impressive to the point where I'll have Hopkins in these middle rounds being drafted. I don't think he can be drafted here. He's definitely a higher pick than 10 to me. And I think the only way Will Levis gets out of this undrafted form and becomes like a valuable pick for fantasy goers is if he has this really good season with these 2 wide receivers. So We'll see how it goes. I think that the Titans wide receiver core is pretty good, but just not up here, if that makes sense. And then we got Tyler Boyd, who was recently acquired from the Bengals and is now Tennessee Titan. He had 667 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns. That's 68 fantasy points. That was 58th among all wide receivers. So Boyd has always been, to me, an undrafted player, but one who is really close to always being a high level, high free agent, if that makes sense. I keep saying if that makes sense. I hope it does make sense. He's just always sitting at the top of free agency week in and week out, just waiting for somebody to pick him up for a week, maybe drop him, or maybe keep him on the bench. I just don't see how those stats can produce a top 15 pick. Next up, we have Chigozie Okonkwo, and last year he had 528 receiving yards, 1 touchdown. That's 50 fantasy points. That was 25th among all tight ends. I do think he's going to get better. I mean, this is one of the tight ends who isn't at star level, but is reliable. I feel like he can be a David Njoku if, the Titans get going like that. Because of this, I'm going to have him here. Instead of being undrafted, where most people would put him, I think he can be drafted very late. So I want to know what you guys think about that pick. I think it's an interesting one, but I kind of like this spot for him. And then lastly, we have the Titans defense. The Titans defense last year had 133 fantasy points. That's 27th. That's bad. That is bad. They did get some upgrades this year with L'Jarius Sneed joining the team, but I don't think his inclusion is enough to make it better. I think that they're going to go undrafted. Maybe from here in and here out, you'll pick them up for certain weeks. They're playing against very bad offenses. That's what's going to happen. And if they can actually get better on defense, maybe in later drafts, they will be considered a draftable defense. But for now, I don't really see them being drafted that much. Which means only 5 players get drafted in my opinion. Calvin Ridley, DeAndre Hopkins, Tony Pollard, Chigozie Okonkwo, and Tyjae Spears. The other 3, the defense, Tyler Boyd, and Will Levis, do not get the draft nod from me. And now we have the Indianapolis Colts. First up, we have Anthony Richardson. Now, he didn't play a lot of games last year and was in the same rookie class as Bryce Young and CJ Stroud. But when he played, I'm telling you, he showed glimpses of brilliance. He had 557 passing yards, 136 rushing yards, 7 touchdowns, and only 1 interception. That was 76 fantasy points within 4 or 5 games, and that was 40th among all quarterbacks throughout the year. We all know that a healthy Anthony Richardson has the potential to be something special. I think even though you're going to want to play safe, he is somebody I would draft in these late rounds. I don't know if I'd draft him high just yet, but I do think he gets the nod from me despite Will Levis having more playing time than him. I just think that he has a lot more potential and talent, even if he doesn't have the better receiving core. And because of that, I think that he's worth drafting. I think he can be the next Cam Newton. And at times, Cam Newton for fantasy football was one of the best players to have. I've had him in 2015 during the Super Bowl run year. That was a special fantasy football year. I didn't win, but I came very close. So give the nod to Anthony Richardson, but just kind of later down here. Next up, we have Jonathan Taylor. Now, Jonathan Taylor is one of the most talented running backs in the league, and last year, even though he didn't play all the games, he had 741 rushing yards and 5 touchdowns with 127 fantasy points. That was 28th. That would suggest he's somewhere down here, but I imagine without the distractions and without the injuries, you play a full season, he is still somebody you draft even as high as round 1. So, Jonathan Taylor, you gotta keep your mind open about him, because remember, a couple seasons ago, he was outright the best running back in the entire NFL for a season before all the injuries and the drama off field took place. So if he can just return back to that form, everybody's going to want him. Shoot, he might go higher than what he's projected, which is a round 9, round 10 type of pick. Next up, we have Michael Pittman Jr. He has 1,152 receiving yards, 4 touchdowns. That's 134 fantasy points. That made him 25th among all wide receivers, which is wide receiver 3 levels. Michael Pittman, you keep Anthony Richardson. I think he can have, moments of going off too. I would say he's here in the round 6 through 9. I don't know if I would consider him a high pick there or a lower pick, but this is a fair pick, I believe. So Michael Pittman is, well, aside from Jonathan Taylor, he's going to probably be the highest pick from here on out. Maybe the Colts defense gets a nod. I guess we'll find out. Next up, we have Josh Downs. Josh Downs is the secondary wide receiver, which, yeah, I guess. I mean, they have Adonai Mitchell, so there's that to look forward to as well. He had 771 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns. That's 82 fantasy points. That was 49th among all wide receivers. Yeah, no, that's not somebody I would draft. I guess, again, let's see what Anthony Richardson is able to do this year being fully healthy. So I guess there's just a lot of what ifs, and it's all surrounding Anthony Richardson. Next up, we have Jelani Woods, who had no stats last year because he was out for an entire season. So I don't have a good, sample size. But from his stats the year prior, I would say he could be a very late tight end draft pick. Because of his stats prior, it does look like he can be a pretty good tight end to have on your bench, but not good enough to be a starter. And then lastly, we have the Colts defense, who had 178 fantasy points. That was top 10 at number 10. So the Colts defense is probably going to be somewhere in here. I mean, that's very impressive to have. And I believe they actually have the best defense in the entire AFC South, just to give perspective. So that's kind of why the Colts were on the threshold of making the playoffs last year, but just couldn't get over the hump. So yeah, the Colts are there, which means that Jonathan Taylor is our only player so far to be a rounds 1 through 2 type of draft pick. But then Pittman and the defense is sitting there in the round 6 through 9. Anthony Richardson still has a lot more to prove. Jelani Woods needs some work. And then lastly, Josh Downs is somebody I would not draft. But lastly, it's time to move on to the Jacksonville Jaguars. First up, we're starting with Trevor Lawrence, and by the way, congratulations on an incredible deal, 5 years. Lawrence has been impressive when he's played fully healthy. When he's not fully healthy, he's been kind of meh, but again, we're starting on a clean slate. He is going to be fully healthy going into this year. Last year, he had 4,016 passing yards, 339 rushing yards, 25 touchdowns, and 14 interceptions. That's 299 fantasy points, which was 13th among all quarterbacks. So already off the bat, the interceptions are a problem. But he has so many weapons around him that I would consider him to be late here in the rounds 3 through 5. I think he'll be maybe a round 5 pick, but I think he's close to being a top 10 quarterback. I don't think he's a top 10 quarterback, but I think he's just right there and could potentially be your starting quarterback on your fantasy team. Next up, we have Travis Etienne. Now, Etienne was on my team last year along with Breece Hall, Pacheco, who I got pretty late, and Javonte Williams. So I had a really good running back core. And in the championship game, he put up like 29 or 39 fantasy points, which is just incredible. He's been one of my most reliable players, and even though he had cold moments last year, he had great statistics. 1,008 rushing yards, 476 receiving yards, 12 touchdowns. That's 208 fantasy points. He was top 5 at number 5. Etienne, in my opinion, easily deserves to be up here. I think that Jonathan Taylor is better when he's fully healthy, but I believe Etienne is either a late 1 or a definite round 2 type of pick. So I'm excited to potentially see them going off the board, him especially because, of course, he was on my team when I won it all. As you can see right here, that was the team that, got me over the hump. And now we have Christian Kirk. Christian Kirk had 787 receiving yards, 3 touchdowns. That's 88 fantasy points, which was 46th among all receivers. Now, That's not pretty good. But I do also think that a lot of that went to Calvin Ridley. Now he's back into being the number one wide receiver, which he was the year they went to the playoffs and lost to the Chiefs in the divisional round. And during that year, he was super impressive. To me, he's somewhere in these rounds. I don't think you can drop him below 10 through 15. As a number one, I think he sits in the middle rounds very well. I just can't put him any higher, even though I have like high aspirations for him because of the stats of the year prior. It's really tough to see where he's going to be this year around, but I think he'll definitely be better. And then you got Gabriel Davis, 746 receiving yards, 7 touchdowns, 114 fantasy points. That was 35th among all wide receivers. Remember, he was secondary wide receiver for the Bills. And he's actually somebody I did draft last year and immediately got rid of because I was impatient with him, to say the least. But still, he did really well and almost had as much receiving yards as Christian Kirk. I think that he is somebody who you're going to draft somewhere close to Tank Dell. I think Tank Dell gets the nod over Gabriel Davis, but Davis is still draftable, and I'd recommend him. I mean, he can put up a lot of stats. Now, this isn't Buffalo, but I think Trevor Lawrence will use him well. Next up, we have Evan Ingram, and Ingram last year had 963 receiving yards, 4 touchdowns. That's 108 fantasy points. That was 6th among all tight ends. So we had Dalton Schultz being top 10, but I think Evan Ingram is easily some tight end you're going to draft really early to establish your tight end 1. And I would not blame you if you get him somewhere in the round 6. Now, I don't see him being a top 5 draft pick. There's not many tight ends you draft that early. I mean, outside of Kelsey and potentially Sam Laporta, who else are you really drafting that early? George Kittle? So round 6 through 9, I think, is a fair place to have him. And then lastly, we have the Jags defense. The Jags defense last year had 150 fantasy points. That was 21st among all defenses. I think they do get better, though. And they're going to be a late draft pick. Potentially your number 2 defense, maybe a team that does end up going undrafted, but often is very high week in and week out. And you'd probably pick them up as your backup defense, maybe. Maybe that's your strategy. But I think right here would be the perfect spot for them. Which then finishes off our list. Now, after I'm done talking about the Jaguars and where I place them, I'm actually going to do something a little fun, so stay tuned. Travis Etienne is rounds 1 through 2. Trevor Lawrence is around 3 through 5, a late 5. Evan Ingram, I think, is an early round 6 through 9, while Christian Kirk is a late 6 through 9. Gabriel Davis is an early rounds 10 through 15, while I think that the Jags defense is a later rounds 10 through 15, almost bordering undrafted. I kind of wanted to calculate how good these players did last year and see how that reflected for the team going into this year. The Texans last year had a total of 1,266 fantasy points from these players specifically that you see on the board, which means that they averaged 158.25 points per game among these players. So among 8 players, that's definitely over 10 points per game. So that's something to look forward to. For the Titans had 894 fantasy points. That's 111.75 fantasy points per game, which is just close to being 10 points per game among 8 players. So that wasn't as impressive, and obviously it shows. The Colts last year had 597 fantasy points, which was 119.4 average per week among 6 players, which is actually pretty impressive. That's close. That's really close to a 20 points per player average, which is really good. And then lastly, for the Jaguars, they had 967 total fantasy points, which is 161.17 average. That is higher than the Texans average. So what is that? Close to, with 6 players, that's close to 30? No. Closer to 25 points per game, a little higher than that, which is really, really good if you're a Jags fan. So ultimately, the Jags and the Texans are towards the top of the division. The Colts is playing middle ground, but really low and close to the Titans, who I think are the worst team statistically on here, which reflects the list a little bit. So this is the list of who I think is going to be drafted and where from these 4 teams. I want to know what you guys think, where you'd place them. But anyways, let's get to the outro. Thank you so much for watching today's episode, and if you enjoyed, please leave a like, comment down below, and subscribe. Go follow me on all my social medias, and be in tune for my shorts. I know the shorts don't come out every day, but when they do, I'm relatively going to put 2 to 4 shorts a day on days that they do come out, which I need to get better with, obviously, but I think I will once the football season does get around. Good luck to the Texans, to the Colts, to the Titans, to the Jags this year, and I might even have some players from fantasy selected in this year's draft. I guess we're gonna have to wait and see. Anyways, that'll do it for me. Though, actually, one more thing. I'm very excited as a Mavericks fan. We just got Klay Thompson, so that's just the last thing I want to talk about. So yeah, I hope you guys have a great day. Take care, and I'll see you all in the next episode, which should be the NFC South. So stay tuned. All right, see ya.